Hello friends, we are now live again, hopefully with audio that does not suck quite as much as my last time. And yeah, so a few issues you want to go to before we do the backlog review. I mean, maybe we never get to the backlog because there's like 6 issues or something, but we'll see. So Corey, this one is yours.
Currently, version. For such as enable default will be interpreted as a which someone's start on, or they can since microservices and they know exactly what version they need.
I see. So I was about to say, like, this sounds familiar because you already added the default version in HTTP client, I think, recently, right? And the version 1.
Yeah.
And so this one is effectively controlling, I guess on the default one it makes sense to me, but then I don't understand is what that means for the request message.
So the request message version right now is also a maximum. So if someone wants an exact version, they have no way of specifying that right now.
But the maximum of what?
It's the maximum HTTP version that we will use. So if they ask for HTTP 2, we will, depending on the URL, we will either connect with TLS and get HTTP 2 through version negotiation, or we might get HTTP 1 through that version negotiation. Or if we're not on TLS, we just won't try and we'll go to HTTP 1 immediately. So this enables people to have more control. Currently, they can find out which HTTP version the request ended up going on just by checking the response version. But sometimes you want to make sure your request goes out in an exact version.
Yeah, I have to say, like, this is going into the direction that I was afraid we would end up with when we added the 2 properties of, like, okay, now we have more and more policy on how the version number is actually being selected. But I guess that's kind of what needs to happen.
Yeah, this becomes even more useful with HTTP 3 because that one is not over TCP, so we can't use TLS to negotiate the version. If someone has something that they know is HTTP 3 and they try to connect to that, they will always end up going through 1 or 2 right now before they get to 3. So this enables them to say, like, I know HTTP 3 exists, just try that and exactly that. And pre-negotiated clear text HTTP 2 is something that James was asking for with gRPC. I guess some of their customers are interested in that.
Yeah, it impacts clear text or H2C, where you do HTTP over clear text, where there's no negotiation channel. And again, I think the spec cannot try to discourage that, but a lot of people want to do it for microservices, for cases where, for example, the gRPC is used cross-process communication. And I agree with you, Imo. It's kind of tricky. I wish we have some easier way how to do that, but we kind of already set on a path on being the maximum and sort of being us trying to be smart, and it doesn't work in all cases.
If it makes sense to have a version or lower, does it ever make sense to say request version or anything else? I mean, there's no option like that.
Yeah, there's no option
requested version first.
Yeah, request a version first, and then either go higher or lower, whatever would make the most sense, I guess.
Yeah, so the way a user could ask for that with this, if they set a version of, for instance, HTTP 3 and say request version or lower, they will get the current behavior of starting on 1 or 2 and then upgrading to 3 if possible. So that kind of accomplishes that. But I'm not really sure when a user would want to say, just give me any version, where the defaults would not be fine for them currently.
So looking through the issue description, is there an actual scenario written in the issue description for where you would want to cap the HTTP version at a maximum value? Like the minimum value scenario totally makes sense, especially if you know for a fact you're using gRPC, like you had said previously. But capping, though.
Crappy IoT devices.
I mean, capping is the current default, so you kind of need to have that.
It's the current default, and it might also be used if, say, a server advertises that it supports HTTP 2, but you know for a fact that their implementation is broken. You can say, just stick on 1.1, that sort of thing.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative that I would think of, which would be hard given the current property names, would be that we want to express it as min and max. But if we go with this one, I would suggest that request becomes requested, because usually the adjective is the past participle and not the active verb form.
Well, I read it as the noun, right? Like the request's version number, if you will.
Yeah, it's
Fair enough. I read it as the verb.
To the request message version, but requested, I can see that making sense too.
Either one works for me. So,
Fair enough. But yeah, that interpretation did not occur to me at all while reading this. I read it as the active verb request. English is hard.
You're American. What did you know about English?
Nothing.
well, you're English. You speak the wrong one.
Sorry, and my audio cut out for a minute earlier. Like, did someone bring up the idea of saying I'm requesting exactly these specific versions and any one of them is okay? I guess that would be min-max almost.
We did think about that, but couldn't quite think of a use case where someone would want, just 1 and 3, for instance, skipping 2, that sort of thing.
Buggy IoT devices?
Yeah, but I feel that on that one you would just you can work around it with caller behavior. Of you say that you request exactly 3, that fails. You request exactly 1. You remember that 1 is what worked on this channel.
Sure.
So. Yeah, given that I think it would be hard to add min and max, or to change the semantics to min and max, because then we'd have min, max, and default, or default and max. This is probably the cleanest enhancement.
Yeah, I mean, one question I have is like, are we piecemealing more and more of these properties in? Are we eventually better off just having a method that allows a little bit more, parameters or whatever, rather than individual properties where it becomes progressively harder to understand what's going on? Or are we confident that this is it?
I mean, I'm trying to think of what you could do in such a method that you couldn't do when you are constructing the HTTP request message object.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like methods give you a bit more flexibility on shape, right? You can have different kinds of operations with different overloads, right? And then whatever you call it last is the effective policy, right? Like the problem with properties is if you have 3 or 4 of them, then you have to reason about what if you set them all, like who is winning over whom, right? If you have individual methods, it's kind of clear like what combination of data is used at a particular point in time.
Gotcha. I misinterpreted that to mean a callback. You're just saying an overload instead of a property.
Yeah, because I mean, if this is it, I think I'm okay with that. But if we're adding more and more policy properties, where eventually you're like, well, what if I set this combination of properties? What does that actually mean? That becomes harder, right? If you have different methods where you say, I don't know, use request policy, and then you do something like this, then it's a little bit easier to understand what at any given point in time is the active policy, right? But I mean, if this is it, I'm okay with that. But if we add more and more, then eventually it becomes a bit of a problem maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we can't know what will come in the future. Everything currently is specified through properties, so it kind of fits the style that we have right now.
Is there any app context setting for these? No, right? The app context is just for the global policy, right?
There is currently an app context switch to enable unencrypted HTTP2, and putting this API in will allow us to get rid of that.
All right.
Did you say earlier that today we do the max?
Today's version is a maximum version. We might end up sticking your request on a lower version.
Okay, so here it shows that the default would be version or lower. Is that going to potentially break anyone?
That's what it means to be the max.
Version or lower is the max. Okay, so the max stops at the current version.
So you specify version 2 and you're saying give me version 2 or lower.
Okay, so you can never specify a version greater than the whatever.
Right. Basically, today you specify one version as the version, and then the system might use that, or it might use a lower version, but it'll never use a higher version than what you specified.
Okay, yeah, it's just confusing max and higher. I mean, they kind of look the same, but okay. So the default is what we have today then. I mean, shown on the API here.
Yes.
All right then. In that case, unless somebody has any concerns, I would just approve it as is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that perhaps the question that Emo was asking earlier in a different form is, do we think that there's going to be enough complexity going on that HTTP version policy should be a class and that someone can implement one? Or do we think that the enum is going to suffice for the next at least 2 releases?
And just to chime in, on a lot of the version detections, there's a lot of times policy, like, hey, I'll take a patch version or a minor version, but not a major version. I don't know if that applies to HTTP that often, but it's a common practice anyway. Yeah,
the version property already has patches in it. You can do 1.1 or 3.1 in theory.
It is not integer, it's a version structure. So also I would say looking at the speed of HTTP2 stabilization and HTTP3, I think it's probably years and years before we will come with HTTP4. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Corey, but I don't think we envision any new versions or changes anytime soon, right?
I mean, I figured HTTP2 would last longer than it did, so we'll see how long 3 lasts.
And just wait until vNext doesn't use integers. So yeah.
Yeah, then we've got a much larger problem.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, then. I mean, versioning is almost always sad, right? So in this case, it is what it is.
Yeah, just wait until you have to negotiate extensions, not just a version. That'll be fun.
HTTP 2 and 3 have a mechanism for extensions right now.
Yeah, but do we expose that through a public API?
No. One thing to maybe they're kind of just send some data and one side knows how to interpret it right now, so it would need a bit of thought. One thing to consider with this API is that we're treating it as an explicit opt-in for unencrypted HTTP2. So currently, we kind of protect you and say if you give us a HTTP URL, but you ask for HTTP2, we just don't do it because we would have to do it unencrypted. And if you specify request version or higher or exact, we treat that as an opt-in. You know what you're doing. You want it to be unencrypted.
How would that fit in? Would there be different enum members then, or would this be an orthogonal choice?
Just between these three enum choices, 2 of them will enable that option. And that is consistent with behavior of like curl, for instance, where if you ask for HTTP2 and you give them a unencrypted URL, it will try unencrypted HTTP2.
I see.
So this allows us to get rid of the app context, or get a programmatic way how somebody can do that.
Yeah, and the thought is that because this is not a default, it's an okay way for people to opt into that behavior. One way that it might be used is if you have an HTTP1 connection and the server advertises that it can upgrade to HTTP2 clear text, we would then take that choice because you're already unencrypted and you're fine with it.
Right. Yeah, if you feel like you need to make changes, come back to us, but I have a hard time visualizing all the consequences.
Okay.
All right, Levi. Create APIs to deal with processing ASCII text.
Yep. So this was a request from a few partner teams like Azure SDK and others as well. I actually made some changes to this from the last time we looked at it, just to kind of clear up some of the scenarios a bit. One of the open questions from last time was why do some of the APIs ignore non-ASCII data, and why do other APIs treat non-ASCII data as a failure condition rather than just ignoring it? And I added some scenarios that I think kind of explain that in a bit more detail. So, for example, when we first reviewed this, we had an equals ignore case method that takes a read-only span of byte on the left and a read-only span of byte on the right. And the original proposed behavior there was for any A through Z character in left or right, normalize that. That way, like a lowercase a on the left will match an uppercase a on the right. And for non-ASCII bytes, just treat them as opaque. So if you have a non-ASCII byte, whatever on the left, it must exactly match a non-ASCII byte, whatever on the right. So one of the changes that I made from last time is I realized that there are scenarios where we should have char overloads of this method, not just byte overloads. The reason for that is if you're dealing with something where you already have processed the data as text, so you already have a string or a char array or something similar, but you still need to fulfill networking protocols. Like, well, those networking protocols are still going to follow ASCII casing semantics. So that means that the existing casing routines built into the framework, such as ordinal ignore case, invariant culture ignore case, and so on, are not sufficient for the purposes that you'll actually need. So if you scroll back up to the proposal all up, I went and I added a bunch of char overloads where there were previously only byte overloads. And I think with the introduction of these overloads, that actually makes sense for the behavior of, well, if it's not ASCII, I don't know what it means, but I'm going to assume it's correct. So I'm just going to say the thing on the left must exactly match the thing on the right. Because maybe you have an accented character or something similar, which shouldn't be treated as failure. It should just be ignored. Because if all you're doing is casing, well, I don't care about it. I should just skip it and move on to the next piece of data. Does that make sense from a scenario perspective? I realize that was a big word salad right there. Concrete example. You have a request line coming in over HTTP, and you want to know if the first few characters are exactly the words get, post, put, whatever in any casing, but you don't care about anything after that. Like the rest of the request line can have non-ASCII data. It shouldn't cause equal starts with whatever to fail.
All right, so I was just diffing it because I needed to like remind myself what the difference is. So basically you just added, yeah, basically what you added was this guy here, right?
Yeah.
And this guy here, right?
Yeah, and for a lot of the other APIs, char overloads were added if they didn't exist as part of the original proposal.
Yeah, we only, like last time, the only thing we reviewed was index off, and then we stopped. So like everything after index off, we haven't reviewed anyway, so I wouldn't care. So,
but for starts with, like, if you were looking for starts with ignore case, I guess, post, that would only look at the first 4 things. So why would the presence of non-7-bit characters influence it? Like, if you find a non-7-bit character in the first 4 things, it's obviously false. But
right, and maybe starts with was a bad example, but it was supposed to demonstrate that there are probably scenarios where if all you're asking for is an ASCII case insensitive check, I shouldn't assume that non-ASCII data is invalid. I should assume that I don't know how to interpret it and that I should just skip it as part of performing the check.
That is contrary to my expectations.
Why?
If I'm using a 7-bit ASCII utility thing and it finds something that's not 7-bit ASCII, then the question no longer makes sense. That would really be an exception.
So this behavior kind of already exists today in string, because string can contain data that's not actually valid UTF-16, and you can still perform case queries and similar operations over it. And the behavior of all of those APIs today is to just skip over that data because it doesn't know how to process it.
But so skip is then just compare for equality?
Yeah, for the particular bytes that it doesn't, for the particular elements that it doesn't know how to interpret, skip is treat them as an ordinal comparison. And then, yeah.
Okay, but your ordinal ignore case is not going to say, or sorry, equals ignore case is going to say false for capital accentity and lowercase accentity because you're not doing 8-bit casing.
Sorry, say that again.
Capital accented or capital E acute and lowercase e acute
will compare as not equal, correct? Because it's not ASCII.
Yeah.
Well, sorry. Let me back up. Let me back up. It depends on how it's represented. There is a scenario where it will compare as equal. There is a scenario where it will compare as unequal. It will compare as equal if the first string contains a lowercase ASCII E followed by a combining accent character, and the second string contains an uppercase ASCII E followed by a combining accent character. Those two strings will be considered equal ignore case. If the strings themselves are each one character, and the one character is capital E with an accent, and the other character is lowercase e with an accent, those strings will be considered unequal.
But again, it feels, I mean, I guess I can understand, because what you're saying is you don't understand the combining character, but that's not even in the 8-bit range. I mean, I guess everything in the 8-bit range makes, or doesn't map between the ASCII and non-ASCII world. But
yeah,
I guess it feels really weird. It rubs me the wrong way that we would do anything other than throw for non-7-bit values. Because I think that people already are confused. I mean, if you get the mismatch surrogate thing, which is the only invalid UTF-16 that I know of, like that is the garbage in, garbage out. But the fact that you can sometimes get what looks like E-acute case normalization and sometimes don't, from a glyph perspective, that just boggles me.
Yeah, it's, there's already a situation today, which is unfortunate, where I mentioned that there were two different representations of an accented E. If you have two different strings with the two different representations, they will already compare today as unequal if you use the string.equals API. It's unfortunate, but it's the way it is. And maybe there is an argument to be made saying we shouldn't propagate that behavior here. And I could see that argument.
Yeah, I think that's the one I'm making. If we're making a new class, we should give it the behavior we want instead of the carrying the legacy that it would if it was a peer to the existing API. But this is new.
Sure. So you're saying that things like equals, ignore case, and others would still, if they encounter any non-ASCII data, even if the unknown data is identical across both inputs, it would still report false.
If I was writing this, that's what I would do, because it means you have given it an input that is outside the domain of the space that it is capable of answering.
Do we envision any scenarios where people are going to migrate from the existing APIs to the new one and expect similar behavior?
I don't think people understand the full range of behavior that can take place today using the existing APIs. So I don't think this would surprise people who otherwise weren't interested in the space.
But we're not talking about throwing, right?
Correct. None of these APIs throws. Not a single one of them.
Okay.
But that's what I want it to do for 8-bit data. Well,
these APIs are all designed to maybe fail, as in return false or return no match if given 8-bit data. But given that these APIs are designed to take untrusted input, like I really don't want them throwing.
Fair. I guess saying that it fails to not match.
I think we probably just won't end up using them anymore.
Yeah. I guess saying that that it always goes into a state of non-match if it finds an 8-bit character is reasonable. So even if you gave it two identical, if you gave it the same string for left and right, but it contained an acute E, it's just going to say false. It's not equal itself under ASCII semantics, which is a defensible position.
Sure. It means that in that case, we would not be able to have an early out check to say, did you pass me the exact same reference for both? And if so, just return true.
Yep.
But sure.
But for the most, I mean, the expectation, I think, is you're using it of you've read a line from an HTTP header, so you're not going to be passing in, like you're going to have your string table existence of the word get versus the one that you just got. So I don't think that the reference equality optimization is really a thing that would be relevant.
Sure.
And you can check reference equals yourself before calling the method.
Well, the idea of these APIs is that we don't want people to have to do a precondition check before calling any of them. The API should just behave in a sane fashion.
But if you want ASCII equals and you give it an acute E, you're not ASCII. So
True.
no,
Okay,
it's not ASCII.
that's fair. Yeah.
That's because it gets really, really frustrating when somebody posts issues of like, hey, I got string equals returned false and I print the two strings and they look equal to me. And so saying, like, if we're saying ASCII, that is data you see is data that exists. There
Sure.
are no magic things as long as we're not backing up when we see backspace.
Sure, and that makes sense too. And to be perfectly honest, I imagine most consumers passing a constant on one side of this, and I would be shocked if they would pass non-ASCII data in that constant.
I agree, and I was even thinking of if it's going to have this weird behavior of that we would need to write an analyzer that says, hey, you've passed in a literal that does not have ASCII, but if it's just going to return false, then now we could do it, but it's just like like, hey, you have an expensive return false here. Maybe just say the word false.
Is
so
this
it's less
discussion? Is this discussion purely about ignore case, or are you also suggesting that the equals should return false even for identical 8-bit values?
Equals would probably return false as well because it's not ASCII equal.
And this isn't going to slow us down at all?
Well, it means that we can't delegate to span.sequence equal. It means that equals, just like equals ignore case, would do an ASCII check on the data before it returns true.
And that's worth it?
If we decide that the behavior is that it really is ASCII equal as opposed to sequence equal, then yeah, that's the behavior of the API.
Well, I guess I'm questioning that decision.
I mean, if we want to say that all of the things that don't say ignore case are non-semantic ordinal, then maybe, and like it's a defensible position, but I don't think that ignore case sometimes handling combining characters because you gave it chars and normalizing across casing for what looks like the same glyph, like that one just really rubs me the wrong way. But if we think that there's enough argument that equals this is really just span.sequence equals, then partially there's the why do we have it. Like if you really want, are these the same byte sequences? There's a method for that. It's span.sequence equals.
How do you do that with byte on the left and char on the right?
We don't have one of those.
Right.
Yeah, but at that point though, it's not sequence equal. Like if you have byte on one side and char on the other, we actually do return false if there's any non-ASCII data anywhere there, because we don't know how to do the conversion otherwise.
Why?
Because if you have byte on the left and char on the right, like we need to normalize both of those into the same representation, but ASCII can't represent data over 127. So if we see any data over 127 on the right, like we literally have no way of transcoding it to bytes, so we have to fail.
The 8-bit range isn't the same between UTF-16 or between Unicode and ASCII. Extended ASCII doesn't map to Unicode for the 7F to FF range.
I guess what I'm saying is this all extended ASCII?
No, it's all ASCII, 0 through 127.
So then why couldn't it just literally be compare values 0 to 255 and anything else can't possibly match?
Because that's not ASCII, that's Latin 1.
Yeah, 129 doesn't mean the same thing when it's in byte form and when it's in char form.
Yeah.
Okay.
If we had a Latin 1 comparison, then we could do that, but this is ASCII.
So this is using char as UC2 and using byte as ASCII.
Yes, correct.
7-bit ASCII.
Yes.
Okay.
A char in the .NET framework is always a UTF-16 code unit.
I was interpreting this to mean interpret char just as a 16-bit integer. Interpret byte as just an 8-bit integer.
No,
Right,
that would be
principle
ISO
of-
88591.
Yeah, principle at least surprise, not principle of fastest code.
Well, for me, it's the type is named ASCII, therefore anything I'm passing in should be interpreted as ASCII.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the point, is there is no comparison between byte and char if, as soon as you exceed 7f.
Let me rephrase. I'm viewing char here as another word for short. Or you should.
Sure. Yeah. But the thing is, ASCII itself doesn't define a concept of a value greater than 127. Like there's no meaning behind it.
So, right. Okay. I think I understand what you're saying. I don't understand why that necessitates meaning that anything 128 or greater means we ignore it. That seems like a policy decision we get to choose, but whatever.
I think that we need to understand, are we saying that users should pass in both left and right, saying these are ASCII? Should one of them always be ASCII? Or should we assume that neither of them, like both of them may use extended bytes?
The most common scenario for this particular set of APIs is going to be raw bytes from the wire on the left and a literal string on the right. And the literal string, because it's a literal string implementing a network protocol, is going to contain ASCII data. Like if you pass non-ASCII data on the right, like you as a caller have done something wrong.
So in that case, are we paying a price for some easily predicted branch to make sure that there are no bytes or characters over 127?
I mean, that's the most common use case, but somebody taking a byte range and then walking over every string in a list and seeing if it calls starts with, and they don't realize that they're going to match on something non-ASCII. Like that's a very nonsensical behavior. And especially if this is designed for untrusted input, it means it needs to be guarded. So if you give it nonsense, it either needs to throw or it needs to return fail.
Yeah, if we want Latin 1 behavior, we should have a separate Latin 1 type that gives us a Latin 1 behavior. And that's also in the comments here.
I guess what I'm struggling with, Jeremy, is if one of those inputs is untrusted, but one of them is something that you supplied, and you supplied it with a trusted input that contained values above 127, isn't the most likely case that you are expecting it to do a value comparison, a bitwise comparison?
No, you have a list of string and you wrote a custom whatever you give string dot index of, the custom comparer that takes everything and just calls ASCII.equals. You don't know what's in your list of strings.
Comparing to what?
Comparing to the data that you just got from the network. So you've got your char on the right, you've got your byte on the left, and your strings are you read some stuff from somewhere. Maybe it's just because it's data that you already have in your process doesn't mean it's trusted.
Well, the scenario that Levi described, which is what we have everywhere in HTTP client and ASP.NET, is you have a set of headers that you know about.
Sure, and I agree.
It's not the only
case
scenario,
where it's a literal, it's sort of a wasted check. But in the case where the char is from some other input source, like there's no way to verify that it's ASCII. I mean, there's no good way for the caller to verify it's ASCII before calling it. They're doing it on faith, and if they get a misalignment between something they read in UTF-16 and something they read in bytes, like that's a security bug.
Well, whether it returns true or false, it could still be a bug.
That's why I wanted it to throw, but I'm willing to accept false.
Whether it returns true, false, or throws, it could still be a bug.
Sure.
Yes.
But again, principle of least surprise. This says ASCII, it should only do ASCII.
To me, that's the more surprising thing, actually. But go ahead.
Well, so what API would you prefer then? Maybe we could work it into this proposal or have another proposal for it.
I'm surprised that it's not behaving, that equals is not behaving like sequence equals, just with different sized data types.
Does that mean that this needs to be a different name to convey the different behavior?
Maybe. Oh, I'm not sure. That's what's surprising me.
Okay.
I think Jeremy makes a good point. If these are not designed for internal use, high performance, we know exactly the scenario it will be used for, then we should probably handle out of ASCII range as an error or return false.
Yeah, so I had mentioned passing literal strings being what I perceive to be the more common scenario. I don't think that's the only scenario, as evidenced by the fact that there are span APIs on this as well. There are scenarios where I think you already have a string that's hydrated into your process, like a username, for instance, and you want to check that against data coming from the network.
Right.
Okay. That's something that I can take for myself then. Like if the name equals is throwing people off as to what the expected behavior here is, then I can take that offline and figure out if there's a more apt method name that would convey the actual behavior.
I mean, you can also offline do a survey. If I'm the only one, then feel free to ignore me. It just, to me, that is immediately what I take this to mean, is that I'm just looking at two values that happen to be different sized integral types.
Yeah.
The fact that there's been a subsequent check to actually make sure that every value, regardless of integral size, is within a specific range, my mind didn't go there.
I mean, I could make the left S byte instead of byte, and that would do the same thing.
Make it uncallable from anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, that's good feedback. Thank you for that. Index of is index of. Sure. I don't have. What is it? So it sounds like index of, just like equals, would then do the return false if the one on the right contains non-ASCII.
The index of is which one's the needle and which one's the haystack?
The left is the haystack and the right is the needle.
Yeah, so if the needle's non-ASCII, then you can't find it. And my expectation is this is greedy from the left, and if it finds it and then it's followed by non-ASCII data, non-7-bit data that you return to the successful match because you didn't necessarily look ahead, I'm okay with also return -1. But
correct. This does not look past where the first successful match is.
Yeah, but as long as it's ASCII up to that point, then I would say it would find it. A last index of, assuming we have that, I would say it's greedy from the right.
Yeah, I didn't write the last index up here, but they do exist for the comment.
And but if the string or read-only span of char contains non-7-bit data, then you clearly can't find it. I mean, like that's an early optimization of your needle is invalid, but like there's just literally no projected sequence of bytes to find.
Sure.
So we're talking about just checking the char version if it's not ASCII, but what about the byte version as well? My input could be lat1, and I might be comparing it against UTF-8. Things would appear equal when perhaps they were not.
Yeah, and that was an open question here. Like if you passed non-ASCII input, I assumed that I was supposed to treat it as opaque binary data, but you raise a really good point that it's almost certainly more likely that the caller did something wrong.
Yeah.
So that should be an indication that we should treat it as a mismatch.
That would be my preference.
Okay.
So just to clarify the
behavior.
behavior
Yeah, so same behavior is equal then.
Of index of. So Jeremy, I think you said when the needle contains non-ASCII characters, we would expect to return -1. I'm a little bit unsure, like what does it mean for if the haystack contains non-ASCII characters? Does it matter, like if the match is anywhere, or would you say it returns only a successful match if until the match is found non-ASCII characters were not encountered?
That I mean that like either is acceptable, but I'm certainly willing to believe that what we're doing is a linear validating scan from the left or the right, depending on if it's index of or last index of, and that you ignore data beyond the match.
Yeah, I would.
But does it
I
mean
would
if you
say that as long
encounter the
as-
first non-ASCII character, you just stop the scan, or would you just say you just keep scanning until you find a match?
I would do the latter. I would scan until I found a match.
But that means that left of your return value, you could have non-ASCII?
Correct, but if you call index of, you don't care about what's on the left of your return value, generally.
But are you validating that what to the right is ASCII? Or are you only validating that the needle was ASCII and you found a match?
Only validating that the needle's ASCII and you found a match, because when you eventually slice out the needle and then use the remaining APIs to inspect the rest of the buffer, eventually one of those APIs will tell you something's wrong.
I will say I kind of agree with Levi, because if you have this rule of like to the left or to the right, like that means we are now stuck with a particular implementation of the algorithm that is forced to go from left to right rather than some parallelized SIMD stuff or something else, right? Which seems wild.
Yeah, I can buy that argument. As long as we validated that the needle is ASCII, we found the byte pattern.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the start of your string. Maybe it's the end of your string. You're the only one who knows, but you now know where the needle is. I can accept that.
Sure. We might actually be able to take advantage of the fact that the data is validated to be ASCII, because that means that we might be able to start smuggling data through the high bit of whatever SIMD operations we use. So I don't expect that it will be a performance hit to have these checks. In fact, it might actually be a perf improvement to have these checks, but I would need to mull on that a bit more.
Yeah, and the string, the overload of index of that takes string, you could use the never actually returns true is ASCII property.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So we talked about index of. Did we already cover get index of first non-ASCII byte?
We did not. Index of is where we stopped.
All right. Then I think let's
looking through your comment.
Going with that.
Sure. So this API I actually use all over the place internally. The reason that I use it all over the place internally is it's used heavily as part of like UTF-8 and UTF-16 counting, because there are optimizations in the transcoding paths that try to count how many bytes or how many characters would not change. And this is a workhorse method to do that counting. I don't know why anybody aside from me would ever need to call it, but I do call it all over the place. So I thought that someone else might need to as well.
So this is just for optimization purposes, where you want to skip all the ASCII, get to something that you actually have to handle in some special way.
Yeah. So transcoding UTF-8, for instance, there are parts of it that can't easily be SIMD optimized, and those parts are the parts that deal with non-ASCII data. So this implementation is a SIMD check to skip over all of the data that can be optimized and then quickly get to the data that requires manual processing. At least that's how I use it internally. Again, I don't really have a scenario for making this public, but I figured that since it has so many call sites internally, it might be more broadly necessary by people.
Yeah, I mean, I think even the like JSON stuff, because it's trying to stay super low level, has this as a private implementation already. So I think it's fine.
So I just noticed that you have string overloads for some of them, but not all of them. Is that intentional?
It was just a convenience.
Yeah, because some of them you only have read-only span of char, right? So like, should we add string overloads for those so you can call them from other languages that don't have implicit conversions, or do we not care?
We could. I only add, so at the moment, I only put in string overloads where I anticipated that somebody might actually pass in a literal. We could add string overloads more generally if we wanted to. But imagine while you're walking through this API review, imagine that if you see string, one of the key scenarios is passing in a literal.
But how is the
That's
difference
the only way you
from
should interpret that.
literals are equally convertible to read-only span of char than non-literals, right? So how did that make a difference?
It's generally easier to reason about an API that does that, at least in my mind.
So don't get me wrong, I think adding overloads for string makes sense. What I'm trying to understand is why some have them and some do not.
It was just a marker, basically, to say I expect someone to pass in a literal here.
I see.
We can remove them. We can propagate them more widely.
Yeah.
I don't really have a strong preference, to be honest.
I mean, the guidance ended up effectively being, if you expect someone from, let's just say VB to call it, then you should overload between read-only span and read-only char. But if you think that it's only going to be called by things that are already doing a bunch of low-level work with spans, then you don't need the string-based overload. So if there's no scenario for someone who has a system.string to ask when did I see non-ASCII data, because they should probably be working with spans, then it doesn't need the overload. But the equals one seems common, etc.
Yeah, we could. I don't have a strong preference on whether we add them. Like if best practice is to add them, we should add them.
Yeah, my argument, I mean, my concern is less about whether we add them or not. It's just we should be consistent. It seems odd to have them in some places and not others. Like either we make a decision, as Jeremy said, that we don't expect VB people or other people from other languages to ever call them, and then they don't exist anywhere, or we just add them everywhere. But like, I think we should make up our mind which one it is.
Yeah. The only cost of the one that takes string is you have to decide what you want to do with null.
I mean, that would be an argument exception at that point.
Right. But you sort of have to look at it individually. Is it normalizing to empty, or is it or is it an ANE? And either's fine. You just need to reason about it for the API.
Sure. What does the implicit conversion do when you convert a null string to read-only span of char?
Much to my dismay, it turns into the empty span.
Yeah.
So then maybe that should be the behavior that we have for empty string. Otherwise,
maybe
empty string's always valid.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the empty string becomes the empty span, but the null string becomes the empty span. But that creates, sometimes it creates problems, and definitely it creates mild inconsistencies when we already had a string version first and it was already throwing an ANE. So
yeah, that's kind of why I'm leaning toward making it an empty string in general, because otherwise you can never add an overload that takes string. Or you can, but it's weird, right? Like,
well, you wouldn't have been able to pass the word null before.
But you could have passed a non-literal string that evaluated to null.
Yes. Or a null cast to string, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so it's just like if you think that it looks like an argument exception, then ANE is appropriate in context, and if it feels like you wouldn't, I guess I don't even know what index of does if you give it the empty needle, like
return 0.
Yeah.
Fair enough. And then it's the question: is that what you want for the null needle? But.
We could also say that this is a specialized API designed for people who just want to parse values coming from the wire. At that point, like you really should be in the span world anyway.
Right, and that's I think Emo's
sure
all or nothing. But I'm willing to say it at method group levels of if we think some of them are going to be common to call from general code. But then we would really be adding byte array overloads as well, and so it's probably just small.
Okay, so let's leave off string for now, and we can always add it later if we needed to, with the caveat that null would have to normalize to empty.
Yeah, I'm okay with not doing string at all, because literal should already work, at least from the languages we care about, and it's not that this thing does anything that we can't do already, right? It's just that's meant to be a low-level API, and so we can always add support later.
Yeah.
All right, then I think, we just covered get index of first non-ASCII byte. Did we already cover is all ASCII?
No.
What, I guess that does the same thing, right? Except it compares the result to -1, I suppose.
It's a behavioral equivalent to calling the method and comparing it against -1. Yes. The implementation is free to be different, but behaviorally it's equivalent.
Makes sense to me. Yeah, they all make sense to me. Anybody else any concerns? Also with is ASCII byte makes also sense.
Yeah, I mean, on that one, I had the mild, do we need the type suffix, but I don't care.
Is there a reason we wouldn't just have is ASCII taking a span, byte, and char?
Actually, that's
So
a good point.
is all ASCII and is ASCII byte and is ASCII char all get the same method name?
Yeah. Because logically, you check the entire input for being
we could
ASCII,
do that.
right? Yeah, I think I like that.
Yeah. We can reason about it as essentially the single input, or the single inputs are helping you when you have the list of length 1.
Yeah, I did struggle as to whether to even have the elemental overloads there. And the reason that I eventually included them is because there is still in some circles confusion over what the exact definition of ASCII is. Does it include the 8th bit? Does it include the value 127? And I figured having these elemental APIs says, look, the rest of the APIs on this type are opinionated as to what exactly an ASCII value is. So this is a way to get the exact same opinionated check without you having to reason about it inside your own code.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think we can rename them all to is ASCII.
Yeah.
Is all ASCII, is all ASCII, is ASCII byte, and is ASCII char. I think they can all be overloads of is ASCII.
Sure. In general, should we even have the byte and char suffixes on some of these methods? So going back to the get index of API, like, should we drop byte and char and just call it value?
I would not even call value, right? I would just say.
Well, ending with non-ASCII is weird.
Yeah, I guess that's true here. Can we say character here, or do I get shut down by the Unicode police?
You can call it character if you want to, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, it's wordy.
I think Barry just fell out of the chair.
Well, I think even using all the various interpretations of Unicode definition of character, as long as you're limiting yourself to 7-bit ASCII, it all maps, unless they exclude control characters.
And control
Just say
characters, the C0 controls do fall under ASCII, yes.
I would leave those as they are. I don't see a reason to
Yeah, I mean,
changing it to element so that we have a noun there just makes it longer with no real gain.
Okay.
yeah, and value seems like we try too hard to make it the same thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Okay.
Levi, for is ASCII, you said a lot of this has to be quite opinionated. Do we have to define those same opinions for rune.is ASCII? And would
It's the same.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
No, thanks for bringing that up, though.
All right, so on, so assuming we're moving on with to lower invariant, you don't have crossways. Is that intentional?
I
have byte to
think
byte.
Corey, weren't you actually pushing for crossways?
Yes. We use that in HTTP.
Okay, so you also want byte to char and char to byte.
Correct,
at least char to byte. I don't think that we use byte to char.
Yeah,
yeah, we should. We
have 3 of the 4. We should add the 4th one.
Yeah.
So 2 notes there. First off, we should probably drop invariant from the name here, just because we dropped ordinal from the other APIs.
Okay.
Second, if we're doing crossways, we now have to figure out what we do when we see data that can't be converted. Does that throw it? Does it become a try method? Bring .2 lower and every other 2 lower.
So some of the samples that I was able to find for that in our HTTP code, we have both just truncating to byte, whatever number it gets wins, and we also have throwing scenarios. So.
So you can always go from byte to char, like that's fine. You can't always go, well, you can't, that's a problem. Because you're now changing the representation of it. And you don't know what the representation means.
Yeah, as soon as you leave the 7-bit range, it's there is you're in nonsense as far as this class is concerned.
Well, it's the combination of leaving the 7-bit range and doing a transcoding operation at the same time. If you do only one or only the other, you don't have the concern. As soon as you do both, you have a problem.
Well, can we be consistent across all of these APIs? I would rather not have some of them that return false if it sees non-ASCII and other ones that just ignore non-ASCII or things like that. I feel like they should all error out if they see non-ASCII.
That's not the behavior, though, of any other text processing API we have anywhere in the framework.
Yeah,
like there should be some consistency there. And when you have an API like this, which is going element by element by element and processing the element, generally the easiest thing to do is to skip things that you don't know about.
Yeah, I don't like it.
Okay.
I mean,
I feel like if we're saying that this should skip, then that raises the question, should all of the other ones also skip?
They do, except for the ones where they have to make a yes or no answer based on the element value. All the other ones do skip.
Whereby other ones you mean here down? Because
well, no, like index of, for instance, we said index of skips non-ASCII data. It doesn't fail if non-ASCII data appears in the haystack. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this would be similar. It would skip non-ASCII data, assuming it doesn't have to transcode. Transcoding is what throws a wrench into it. But that's only when you start having crossways, though.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have crossways, then you can literally just take the input that you don't know and copy it to the output, because you're not changing the representation. That's, yeah.
So should we just...
Sorry, go ahead.
Should we just try to just approve what we currently have and then move on? Because the problem is you only have 50 minutes left and there's like 6 more issues that we need to unblock people on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I mean, if you want to do crosswise, we can still design that, but then maybe let's do that outside this meeting.
Sure, sounds good.
So you suggested that dropping invariant from the 2 lower ones, right?
And yeah, because we dropped ordinal from equals, so we may as well drop invariant here and just document on the class not a single one of these APIs is culture aware.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no ASCII cultures.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense for me.
Yeah, the destination being too short, returning -1 sounds weird.
That matches the pattern we already have on things like span.toUpper.
Okay, I don't think it matches what we approved for buffer guidance, but...
So what would you do instead?
Well, I mean, you know as a precondition that the size won't change. So if you pass destination smaller than source, throw. Like, you should have dealt with that. It's not a try method. You have to do the right thing.
That absolutely is a precondition here. We will write exactly as many elements as we read.
Yeah.
Most text.
So I would say if source.length is greater than destination.length, throw argument exception destination.
Yeah, I would agree.
So
with
we
that.
would have the caller. So we would have the caller check that.
Yep.
We would. So even if we had that behavior, we would probably still want to return an int, because returning an int makes it easy to chain these.
Yeah. I'm like, returning the int is goodness. I'm just saying what we had for simple buffer writing methods was if destination's too small, that's an exception.
Okay, so we wouldn't follow the behavior we already have on things like memory extensions. We would say it's up to the caller to check this condition and then handle it appropriately.
I mean, we wrote a bunch of stuff effectively prototyping span through the BCL and then shipped it, and then we wrote the guidance of what we wish we had done. So
okay, that's fine.
All right, so do I have to scroll? I guess I do.
Yeah,
And then there are elemental to upper and to lower. Oh, and in place to upper and to lower. Christoph was actually asking for the in place versions. Or maybe we just don't leave these. Maybe we just leave these methods off entirely and say the existing to lower to upper can handle in place.
How would they handle that? Because you can pass in the same span on both sides?
Yes.
Okay.
yeah, yeah, never mind.
It just means that we would have to complicate the logic of the other methods in order to check if their source and destinations overlap, which I was not planning on doing. But
the existing in-place methods don't operate on byte, correct?
there are no existing in-place methods.
By that I mean calling to upper with source and destination equal to each other.
Correct, they work with char.
Oh no, you can't do that. It throws.
Does it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, because I think it was intended to work, and then we made it not. Yeah. So maybe we say then that the original methods don't handle overlap and the in-place ones do. The in-place ones clearly can't do cross-conversion.
Indeed.
Right.
Yeah, I'm fine with having the in-place ones.
Okay.
Should we, is there value in having a different method group for that, or should there just be normal overloads?
I mean, it seems weird to me if one method in the method group is I guess it's mutating in that it's writing to a destination, but one of them is effectively mutate the input and the other one is read from input and write to output. And that feels different to me for reasons I can't explain.
Yeah, to me, it's like kind of like I hear what you're hearing, but I hear what you're saying. But at the same time, it seems to me like it's very cleanly overloaded by arity, right?
Maybe, but
I'm fine with either one.
We don't often overload by arity because frequently the arity is just complexity and options.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we have an existing problem with string where new users will call just to upper thinking that it's mutating the string.
And here they'll get
that
exception.
Yeah, and I like that in place kind of tells people that yes, this does mutate your buffer. It doesn't return something new.
Yeah.
Okay. So leave in place then.
I think it adds value to be a different method group, yeah.
Okay.
All right, that works for me. Then get hash code.
Get hash code. Yeah, because you might need to shove these into a dictionary. And we need the ability for you to be able to calculate a hash code based on the data. I mean, you can't take spans and shove them into a dictionary, but the spans that you're providing us might be part of a larger buffer where you are managing the dictionary keys yourself. You'll have to provide a comparer to that dictionary. But
Right.
how do you build such a comparer? These APIs let you build that comparer.
Works for me. The only thing I would suggest is probably remove ordinal again and just call it get hashcode ignore case.
Yeah, I missed that. Sorry.
Where else do we have such static get hashcode helpers? I'm wondering if it should actually just be a compare.
So on string, we have get hashcode as a static method.
Okay.
The problem with making a comparer is we're now opinionated as to what the input keys should be on the comparer. And I don't necessarily know what actual data type you're going to use to represent your data. You're probably going to use a byte array or a memory of byte or something like that. So now do we say we have a comparer of memory of byte, and if your data is represented in any other fashion, sorry.
Okay. What about, do we have get hashcode ordinal ignore case methods? I thought for like on string, I thought it took a string comparison as an argument.
It does, yes.
Okay.
The reason that I didn't take a string comparison in any of these APIs is because the only two values that would ever be valid are ordinal and ordinal ignore case, and they behave differently than string.get hashcode, ordinal and ordinal ignore case.
Behave differently how?
String get hashcode ordinal ignore case allows ASCII and non-ASCII characters to transfer between each other, whereas this would not. It would actually produce a different value.
So you're saying this will produce an identical value with string dot, like the top get hashcode overloads will produce identical values with string.get hashcode?
Correct, but ordinal ignore case will produce potentially a different value than string.get hashcode ordinal ignore case, because it's doing a different normalization under the covers.
Okay, for what it's worth, I don't think it matters whether that's coming from a string comparison argument or ordinal ignore case in the name. If we're concerned about that difference, we should be concerned about it either way.
I mean, with the string comparison, the problem is like 4 of the options don't make sense, and we either are mapping them down to the 2 or we're throwing. And then, you know, similar to advice you gave about default arguments versus overloads of like, there's no branch now. The branch was in the caller code, and it's actually not a branch. It's you're calling the ignore case one or not. So
I'm not suggesting they be default. I'm suggesting they call it get hashcode and be overloads.
So we have get hashcode and then take a string comparison?
Yeah, for same 4 methods, just rename get hashcode ordinal ignore case and add a string comparison argument. I guess the
throw for the...
Well, hold on. The 4 that don't make sense, they really like there's nothing you can do for them, or like
we can't do anything for them.
Why?
I mean, I guess you could say that the ASCII culture is non-ignore case, and so you're just mapping 4 things to 2, but that's a Boolean. That'd be Boolean ignore case.
But that doesn't mean like. Are you saying it like
sure?
If someone passed an invariant culture ignore case, you're saying there's literally no way we can produce the right answer for that?
It implies that there's going to be some kind of culture sensitivity taking place, which we can't provide in these APIs.
We can't provide.
Yeah. So say that you pass in something that is culture aware, invariant culture, current culture, something like that. The data that you're passing in, the actual text that you're passing in, we would have to somehow convert that to UTF-16 before we can call the get hashcode routine on it. And if the data that you're passing in is not ASCII data, we have no way of transforming it to UTF-16 before we perform that comparison.
So you're saying that these are happy to accept non-ASCII values?
They have to be, yes.
Yeah, because there's no sensible fail mechanism they would have, so...
That's also one of the reasons that we might want to reconsider the equals method not allowing non-ASCII data.
Right.
Because get hashcode and equals should behave identically.
That's not true.
Like
if equals... If equals is true, get hash code has to be the same result. But if get hash code is the same result, equals does not have to be true.
It doesn't have to be, but one of the behaviors of this get hash code routine is that it is collision resistant. If it's trivial to actually, would that work? I take that back. Never mind.
Yeah, equals should still be defensive, but get hash code. There's no way that you like returning -1 because there was an invalid thing. That is itself a dictionary attack. So it has to do something.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. Anyway, you were saying,
that's,
Steve. Sorry.
Well, I mean, if we have to do something on some of them, it seems like a good reason to do something on all of them. Like it starts to feel very arbitrary when we're doing something versus not.
Comparing things as equal is it has to be ASCII, and the things that return numbers, which is get hash code, return numbers.
I know that's your opinion.
Yeah.
Well, so for things that do case comparison or for things that do hash code calculation, generally what they do is they're iterating element by element and then mapping one element value to another value. The way that the mapping works, at least in my mind, is if you don't know how to map the value, potentially because it's outside of the ASCII range, like it maps to itself and then move on to the next piece of data. So that's why I was saying that to upper to lower ignore non-ASCII data. Get hash code would ignore it as well. And by ignore, I mean it treats it as ordinal and then it just moves on.
Yeah, which doesn't work if we allow someone to pass in the word invariant, because that has different meaning.
I guess I'm still so two lower invariant we can make work.
Well, let's drop the word invariant, because all that means is any byte that it sees that's uppercase A through Z gets turned into lowercase a through Z. Every other byte stays the exact same.
Okay, so why wouldn't?
Sorry?
Okay, so why wouldn't the same semantics apply in get hash code if I passed in ignore case invariant?
Well, he's getting rid of the word invariant in the method name, so it's just too lower.
Okay.
Are you passing in a string comparison or a bool ignore case?
String comparison.
So
I'm trying to like. It feels very weird to me that we've got this one-off where we're taking a value from the string comparison and putting it into the name.
Which is why we should remove ordinal from the name probably and just call it ignore case, because it doesn't directly map. It doesn't actually directly map to any of the string comparison values. It maps to its own thing.
I mean, it's logically the same what we did earlier with equals, right? We have equals and with equals ignore case.
But to your question though, Steve, if we did try to take in a string comparison, then presumably any culture-specific string comparison value that you passed in, we would need to honor in a culture-specific way, because the string comparison enum says, I want you to interpret this as if it were in whatever culture I specified. At that point, we now need to unambiguously transcode from ASCII to UTF-16, which means this API would have to fail if it sees non-ASCII data. And we can't have a get hash code routine fail. And by fail, I mean throw an exception.
Yeah, but if we feel that there's too many method groups, we could make it be a Boolean ignore case, but
which I would be totally fine with.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on a Boolean ignore case versus ignore case in the name.
But yeah, there's also string comparison hasn't been used in any other API here, specifically because none of these APIs map cleanly to the existing string comparison values. I used ordinal ignore case in the method names, but it really doesn't map to string comparison ordinal ignore case. That was a mistake on my end.
To step back for a second, is there a higher level gap here? Should there be a string comparison.ASCII? If there's a semantic here that we're trying to encode in general that isn't representable with the values we have today, does that mean we're missing a value?
Possibly. So we can't add values to string comparison. Like we would break way too many things if we did that. Sorry, let me back up. So string comparison.ASCII ignore case is what you're proposing, right?
I'm asking. I'm not proposing. I'm saying like
Sure.
you've outlined like a bazillion APIs here that are all exposing a semantic that you said doesn't exist on string comparison, which makes me
Right.
question whether this should be that semantic on string comparison.
It feels to me like that would be I mean, I wasn't on the team, in 1999, but it feels like .NET String was really trying to be Unicode and expressing character data. So saying that you want to do an ASCII comparison on a system string is weird. But if you say that you are limiting yourself to the ASCII space and you want to do a comparison, that feels like you've accepted the limitations now. So it feels like this relationship is right, and putting it on the string comparison is awkward.
I could actually see that justification. Like I could see an ASCII ignore case value working on string comparison. Like it would be weird in the sense that it wouldn't have a case sensitive sibling to live on the same type. And it does kind of go against the whole strings are UCS2 data, which is what Java and .NET both did. But as far as the actual behavior goes, we could make it work if such a thing existed.
I guess we're just changing what the case transform is during normalization.
Yes, that's the only thing it would do.
I guess it makes sense as a comparison.
Yeah, that's literally all it would do. It would change the case normalization so that anything outside of A through Z gets ignored.
Honestly, it's what everybody writes if they try writing their own 2-upper anyway. So
yeah. This is basically the 2-upper you would have written in CS 101.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the scenario for these particular APIs, though, was again that you might be storing some larger piece of data into a dictionary or some other collection, and you need to be able to create a comparer somehow. Now, one of Steve's suggestions was maybe we should just make a comparer. And that would be fine, in my opinion, but we don't have a comparer of span today. And I don't know how to make that work.
I mean, in addition to this, we could add the string compare accelerators for ASCII and ASCII ignore case, but or just ASCII ignore case. But
we could, yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I agree with the notion that the span things and the comparers don't play well together.
Do we have any, I asked earlier about get hash code overloads. Do we have any get hash code methods anywhere that take spans today?
Yes, string has get hash code that takes span as a static method. UTF-8 string has them as a static method as well.
And what kind of comparison do those use?
A full string comparison, but they can actually handle all 6 cases easily. And unambiguously.
So in what situation would you choose to use this versus that with ordinal?
With ordinal? Sorry, could you repeat? You cut out.
Yeah, sorry. The get hash code overload here that takes just a buffer. In what situation would I choose to use this versus string.get hash code with a span that takes the buffer?
You have read-only span of byte instead of read-only span of char?
Let's say I have the char. Is it like what? This
get hash code routine is not necessarily guaranteed to be the same as the existing string.get hash code routine. It does not have to follow the same algorithm. It doesn't have to.
Oh, okay.
If it did, that would just be an implementation detail.
Okay, but that aside, like, why would I choose to use one over the other?
Just the same reason that you're using equals instead of span.sequence equal for byte and char and stuff like that. Like you're already using this class for text processing, and it's just the method's there. It's convenient. You want to call it because it's the easiest thing for you to do.
I think it would come down to the question of the guarantee. If we say that get hash code read only span of byte does not guarantee that it would produce the same answer as string.get hash code for the same semantic content, then you need the char one so you could balance. Thanks, Emo.
Hi, Emo.
Because that would be the only way that you could compare a slice of a string to your ASCII buffer, is if you these two have to give the same answer for the same semantic input, but they don't necessarily have to match the one for string. Unless we say that they do have to match, in which case we can eliminate the char one.
I think saying they have to match ties our hands.
They have to match each other, but you're okay with that,
Yes.
right?
They have. Well, what do you mean they have to match each other?
The
char one and the byte
top two overloads have to provide the same result for the same inputs.
Yes, correct. That is correct.
And the bottom two ones have to provide the same results for the same inputs.
Assuming that the inputs are ASCII, yes. In all cases, yeah.
Even if what if they're not ASCII?
If they're not ASCII, then the places where they differ could affect the hash code.
But like if all the values in the read-only span of char were 255 or less, you're saying those still wouldn't produce the same. They may not produce the same results.
Correct. Well, it's whether it produces the same results is not a guarantee. That's the thing, because it's not ASCII data.
This ASCII data thing is going to be the end of me. That feels wrong. But I guess it comes back to the same thing as my equals earlier.
Yeah.
I have just a general clarification question on nulls. I'm assuming any embedded or trailing nulls are treated as a valid element and not ignored or treated as terminators. Is that true?
Correct. Nulls are valid ASCII.
But I think, is your question, Steve, are they treated as string terminators or are they treated as content? And I think they're treated as content because you gave us an explicit length.
Yeah, that was my question. I guess there's three possibilities. One is that's treated as content, they're just ignored, or treated as a null terminator. And I mean, I guess if you have a buffer, that's populated with zeros, for example, and you try to compare against a literal, you'd have to use index self instead of equals, in that type of scenario then.
Yeah, I assume that essentially this is that they're B stars and not null SZs. That's my guess. Levi?
Sorry, say that again?
Does A null B produce the same hash code as AB, or the same hash code as A, or a unique hash code?
It produces the same hash code as A null B. Like A null B by itself is a sequence. Like
right.
It's not equivalent to A.
That's different than A, and it's different than AB.
Correct.
Okay.
And so string.get hash code, by the way, can, depending on your platform, treat all three the same.
Yeah.
Fun.
I would hope not all three are the same. A and AB are different.
It depends on your platform.
Okay.
Depends on your platform for culture sensitive, not for
yes.
Oracle, right? Yeah.
Right, but if you had if you called invariant culture, then depending on your platform, all three could return the same thing.
Sure.
Yeah. See also the S set.
Yeah. Which is one of the reasons we don't do any culture specific stuff here whatsoever.
All right. So did we decide, are we doing Booleans, or are we doing two method groups?
What context? You lost me.
Get hash code is the last thing we talked about. I'm trying to move us on.
So equals is two method group. Like all of the other things are two method groups. Like get hash code probably should be as well, just for symmetry.
Yeah, that's my tie-breaking position as well.
Okay.
Cool.
We're almost done, Emo. Almost done.
Widen and narrow.
Yeah, well, Okay, should we go over a widen to UTF-8 16?
Sorry?
Yes, that's the next one.
Yeah, widen and narrow. So on the UTF-8 class, we actually dropped widen and narrow as prefixes. I just forgot about that for this proposal. And we literally called it to UTF-16 from UTF-16.
Yeah, presumably you want a lowercase t in UTF-16 on narrow, but
Yeah, that's my bad. This doesn't perform substitution. If it sees any non-ASCII data, it returns operation status error or invalid data. It's a typical operation status API.
And they're called read and consumed.
Uh,
I can only see it up to bytes read and chars read. So
it's bytes read, chars written, but we would use whatever.
Oh, sorry. Yes, it's bytes consumed. So read should be consumed. Is our naming guidelines for operation status.
Bytes consumed, chars written. Is that right?
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Things consumed in this case. For the first one, it would be bytes consumed and chars written, and for the second would be chars consumed and bytes written.
Really?
That's what Christoph wanted.
You're right. Okay, no, you're right. We just, I guess we just followed the pattern inconsistently before we had proper guidance. Okay, that's fine. Bytes consumed.
So it's bytes consumed and chars
written. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any problem with the operation status APIs? I mean, I would think these would be the most straightforward ones.
Yeah, other than the names of read to consumed, it looks good. Emo doesn't look happy.
No, I'm just trying to understand. That makes sense.
Will it ever return needs more data?
No.
Because the data unit is one unit. One element.
Even in the char case, the one where you take a real-least pair of char as input?
Correct. It can never return needs more data.
Like, yeah, surrogate pair would be an error in that case, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's invalid data.
And presumably narrow. Oh, never mind. I was thinking like when will you return destination too small, but that can happen anytime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. 2-string seems reasonable.
So 2-string, I wonder if we should actually just kill that and say, you know what, you have encoding.ASCII, just call encoding ASCII get string and call it a day.
Even better.
Let me just double check and make sure that actually does exist.
It does.
Get string read only span byte. Yeah, just call encoding.ASCII, and it also allows you to customize what happens if it sees non-ASCII data.
Yeah. So since you're the one who proposed that trim type method should return range, why are you returning spans?
There is a get trimmed range at the bottom. The trim that returns span was just for convenience, but we could kill all of those. So if you scroll down just like one line, you'll see it.
Yeah, the team's control bar is blocking the methods I want to see.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry for that.
That's all good. So trim works the exact same as string.trim, only it only looks at ASCII whitespace characters. It doesn't look at higher Unicode whitespace characters. It will ignore them if it sees them.
Right. So with get trimmed range, you can implement all 3 of these.
Correct. Absolutely everything can be built on top of get trimmed range.
Yeah.
The only downside is that get trimmed range is going to inspect both sides, so it might be doing more work than necessary. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we think that the others are going to be common enough to really want span to span, I mean, we can leave them as accelerators, but I would suggest cutting it to just the one operation if we think it's sufficient.
Sure, and I did look at uses of string.trim throughout the framework. Trim start and trim end on string are called very rarely. Full on trim is called very commonly.
Yeah.
So maybe that is a good argument to kill all 6 of those overloads.
Or we could make those 6 overloads return range if we think there is a valid optimization there.
Maybe.
Yeah,
I think the name get trimmed range is weird because the trimmed range would be the white space, right?
I guess the range.
True.
This returns the range that results after trimming.
Yeah.
Right.
Which really means it's trim. Yeah, so we could leave the 3 method groups, so leave the 6 methods and make them return range, or we can eliminate start and end and return the range because you could just take the lower or upper bound yourself. But the start and end will half the work it does. Yeah, so based on I would suggest eliminating span and make it span range. And then get trimmed range goes away because, as Corey pointed out, the name suggests it's returning the opposite of what it's returning.
So, okay, so the trim methods all return range rather than spans. Was that your guidance?
That's my recommendation based on your suggested guidance. Yes.
That does mean that these trim methods have an API signature different than all the other trim methods in the framework, but it does make them somewhat more powerful.
Yeah, and it solves our 6-way overload problem. 4-way overload.
I mean, we would. So how many overloads will we end up with in the end? Just 6, or?
We would have the 6 because you're varying on byte and char, so 2 for each method group. But then we don't need read-only span, writable span, read-only memory, and writable memory, and then to decide if we want to do something special with string as well.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
So let me summarize this. So so first of all, I missed the 2-string one. So the 2-string one we decided to drop because there's another overload that we can get already.
Encoding.ASCII can provide that. Encoding.ASCII.getString of the buffer.
All right. We code that one. And then for the trim one, what was the conclusion on that one?
Change the return type of all 6 trim methods to range and delete the 2 methods that are after them.
All right, that makes sense.
Yeah, I do get a little nervous just because the pattern is different than every other trim method, but maybe that's okay.
Well, the other trim methods on string return a new string, so it's
memory extensions, trim methods.
Yeah, but that's where we learned that we were having the oh god, I gave you an array and you gave me a span, and what do I do with that?
Yeah.
Conundrum.
Okay, at least this solves all of that at once.
Yep.
I mean, it makes a call site a little bit weirder, but at least it's doable.
Indeed, it's just it solves our implicit and our implicit conversion to reduce the number of methods we need is still good, and then we don't have the problem of you can't figure out how to get back to your original data type.
Sure.
Are the performance characteristics of 2-string and encoding.ASCII.getString identical?
They're about identical. They're within the range of noise of each other.
Okay.
Can the trim methods just return the same buffer if no trimming occurs?
Yes.
Well, I mean, they're going to return range now, so it would be start to end.
Yeah, they'll return the entire set of data. By the way, I think we would probably want to call these value instead of buffer. I noticed that for all of the other APIs here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, which one is that?
On trim, we would want the inputs to be called value instead of buffer. Same with get hash code.
That is fair.
I just missed that when I worked on this originally.
And then to lower in place probably as well, right? Or do we say that it's buffer?
I would actually keep that as buffer because it's both the source and the destination. Value implies something that's only being read.
I guess that means is ASCII should be value as well.
Yes.
Sometimes you refer to it as text, though. Should we also change text into value as well?
No,
text
it's just on index of.
Yeah, text and value on index of, I believe, is correct.
Okay. Oh, that's right. We already have value there.
Yeah.
That's true.
Let me double check that.
I mean, I know that it doesn't match our naming guidelines, but honestly, I find needle and haystack much more clear.
We call it span and value on memory extensions, but whatever.
Well, on memory extensions, isn't span this parameter?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these are intentionally non-extension methods because we don't want extension methods hanging off of read-only span of byte.
No.
That would be Sad. Okay. Thank you for letting me monopolize your time, Emo.
All good. So let me just post the remainder. All right, so let me just paste all of the stuff in now, in the hopes that I didn't get anything.
Thanks everyone for slogging through that with me. And Steve, I will get I will ponder what you had said about naming and Latin 1 but not ASCII data, and see if maybe we can come up with a more concrete behavior there that would make more sense.
Thanks.
Yep.
Sweet. All right, so let's close this one. This one. Hopefully this is an easy one.
I hope so too.
So basically the gist here is you just want to expose an API that gives you the RID that we are currently running on, which we do not have. There's no easy way to do this today.
We have this method, but it's not like an official system API.
Yeah, it's in this Microsoft.NET Platform Abstractions runtime environment, which my understanding is you want to kill the whole thing, right? Merge it basically with what's useful in there with the rest.
Right, that's kind of the proposal, is to get rid of platform abstractions, the library, and anything that's necessary in it, move into the quote-unquote shared framework. The only thing we've discovered that is absolutely necessary is the give me the current RID of the machine. There are two other APIs that aren't exposed elsewhere, but they aren't. We kind of don't think people should be using them. That's like the get the name of the OS, which is like we'll return Ubuntu, CentOS, et cetera, and then give me the version of the OS, which would return like 16.04, 8, etc.
How is the current method you're talking about? How is it implemented?
Currently in platform, well, so there's two RID calculations in our world. One's written in C++ code and one's written in C# code, and they both have the same logic, which is if you're on Windows, it starts it with win and then gets the current, asks Windows what version it is and then slaps on the version number. If it's on Apple, it just slaps in OS X and then gets the version number. And then for everything else, it goes and reads etc/release OS, parses that out to see what's the distro and what's the version.
So it won't actually be the actual RID. It might be pretty close to it, but there are cases where the actual RID and what this returns are different. In the current one, I realize the new one's gonna be more accurate.
No, well, so both of those, both implementations, the C++ one and the C# one, have the same logic. And so in the cases where we have special cases like Red Hat or Alpine, where we don't want the full version, like we don't want Red Hat 7.3, we just want it to say Red Hat 7.
Right.
Or maybe I might have been doing patch versus minor. It might be 7.3, not 7.3.
No, but that's an example of what I'm talking about. Like it sounds like with the current implementation, that ends up producing a different value than what we would want it to produce.
With the current implementation, we have the logic twice, and so if we update one, we have to go update the other. Does that make sense?
I guess I'm not following. So today, when I access this runtime environment .get runtime identifier, are you saying it's special cases rel?
Yes.
Okay.
Both in the host, right, in the C++ host .net.exe. And because that's the thing that actually gets used at runtime to pick assets for portable apps. And so this is an implementation detail, but the way the managed API is going to be written is basically there's only going to be one implementation, and that's going to be in the host, and the host is going to pass through a new app context variable for the current RID.
Okay.
Which a point of discussion is if you're using a different native host who didn't pass in that app context variable, this API is going to return null because that app context variable is not there.
Sorry, this is minor, but null or empty?
Probably whatever app context returns. When you ask for, I guess it's try git switch, so it's going to be false.
Yeah, I'm just asking because we've started using nullable reference type annotations on stuff, so I was questioning whether this proposed API is actually string question mark.
Right, it should be string question mark. I think it should return null if that's not there. So I can update that to string question mark. And then, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tanner.
I was going to say, if this is going to be used for like switching based on what the current RID is there any need for us to not only return the current runtime identifier, but also the generic runtime identifier, or possibly have a method which says, is this RID compatible with the current RID? Because we'll return win10x64, but people might want to care like winx64 instead if they're like trying to resolve an asset from a native library or something.
Yep. So this proposal, like lower in this whole issue, it talks about those scenarios, and I've scoped them out of this initial removal because we don't have those APIs today. Well, let me back up. We do have those APIs today. By somebody would have to go load the deps.json file that's in the shared framework, which has the full RID graph for the current machine. So that way you can tell win10x64 is compatible with winx64.
But that's probably a future API, it sounds like.
Right, it's not part of this proposal. Yep. This proposal, the reason this one's quote unquote blocking is because I want to get rid of platform abstractions, but we need this new API because we need this new API in the official place where it's going to go before we can delete the old one. Because like things like the SDK relies on this API.
And platform abstractions does not currently define the is RID compatible?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. It just has get current RID and then give me the OS name and OS version, and then other junk like what's the architecture, which we already have APIs for those.
So Eric, is this going to be do exactly what it says here in the proposed API for the implementation and just look at the app context variable?
That's the current proposal is that. Like I put in there about the discussion, should we maintain a managed fallback? Mm-hmm. Jan's opinion was to not do that, to not have them managed.
I mean, it seems like the host has to know that anyways, right? And so we have to have it in native, and then it seems bad to duplicate it and managed, right? So it's easier to just pass the data from the host to the managed environment.
Right. I mean, my only issue is the other hosts, right? Like people who are native hosts that are loading up the CLR and then calling into it. Anybody who calls this API is going to get null.
All right.
But
so
if we
how many do we have today where we have custom hosts? Is this a common scenario, or is it more like a remote scenario?
I don't know. I'd assume it would be growing. For example, like if Visual Studio ever wanted to be on .NET Core, they would have their own custom host. They wouldn't use .NET.exe.
Well, they wouldn't use .NET.exe, but presumably they would use our official hosting APIs, and presumably as part of that, we would support setting these common app context variables, right?
I think that would be up to the host. team to say.
Because
I mean,
because
it's possible.
Yeah, that seems like something that we'd at least want to talk to them about, especially as the number of these app context variables grows, both now and in the future. We're not going to want every single host to have to reduplicate all that logic.
True.
Yeah, but that seems like a code factoring issue more than anything, right? Like, there's nothing fundamentally problematic with sharing that code with hosts and make it available as an API, right?
Right, and that's what I meant. Like, there should be some way for them to trivially, like, move to the .NET 5 runtime host APIs and be able to support this without having to, like, manually copy logic out of our host or anything like that.
Agreed. So then as long as other hosts either use that functionality, as long as they use that functionality, whether it's on by default somehow or just a simple method call that says add runtime identifier app context. Yeah, they should just be able to get it for free.
Is that Jeff's team who owns that?
Yeah. I'd have to look. Like we've changed recently. Like I think in 3.0 we changed what's our recommended host APIs. I could look. It might just be on. I'd have to look. It might just be on by default. Steve Harder, do you happen to know? Since you have some.
Okay, sorry. Can you repeat it?
With the new hosting APIs in .NET Core 3, do these app context variables automatically get put in? Because I know the new ones aren't like core CLR host. Mm-hmm. They're like you load up the host policy.
I don't know. I mean, I'll have to look at the code or ask those guys. I'm assuming they need some other context variables that we flow to the runtime, however, so I'm assuming they're set up properly, but
okay. I can look. I was just wondering if you knew off the top of your head.
And also just a quick question here. I don't know about Linux processes, but I don't know if we should say that there's a guarantee that this is always going to return the same value if somebody messes with this environment variable at runtime. And do we cache it, for example?
So the host, when it loads, it reads that environment variable, if it's there or not. And then it doesn't, the host won't pick new assets if you change that environment variable while it's running, right?
No, I just meant for callers, if they call this, and if somebody wanted to mess it up and, try to set at runtime, change the environment variable, which I don't think you can do in Windows, but I don't know about other operating systems, that it could return different results in some weird, attack type case or something. Basically just cache the value and then, get it once and then return it.
Right. The managed code won't respect the environment variable at all. The managed code just says whatever the host sent to me on the app context is what I'm going to return.
And app context is
that's right.
only?
That's right. I forgot that. I was thinking we looked at the environment variable. Okay.
No, you can set switches in app context.
Yeah, I mean, it might be reasonable to cache it to a static on the type anyway, just because then it avoids going to the dictionary a second time.
Great. Should we change this from a method to a property then? Or?
I'm okay with that. I mean, it seems like it's clearly an O1 access.
Yeah, everything else on runtime information is a property, actually. So runtime identifier seems like it would be a reasonable property as well.
Okay. That returns string ?
Yep.
Okay.
That seems sad, but okay.
Well, that's what we return when the app context variable isn't there.
I know, but honestly, there's one of those areas where we just said that's a bug in the host. Like, that seems pretty fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, if I were calling this API, I would be surprised if it didn't return a default value. But
So what,
from an application,
the string unknown.
There's any. We have an
Yeah.
any rid, which is like the root of all rids.
That's reasonable, actually.
I guess I'm just having trouble wrapping my mind around the concept that the runtime itself, as opposed to a library, might not have an identifier.
Yeah. But that was discussed. It's if somebody uses custom hosts. But yeah, I think it would be reasonable the first time it's accessed that it's ask app context ? The string any, because that matches our rid semantics.
Is there could an application using this API do something valid if it returned null?
Validly crash.
Yeah, I mean, should we just throw if it's not specified in an app context switch? Because I'm trying to think of what a user could actually do with null.
The same thing they do today, which is fall back to things like runtimeinformation.os and other things and try to manually determine a rid.
I would honestly say that we should do this in the runtime. Either the host should automatically set a rid, so the app context thing is never empty, or we should just have the fallback mechanism baked into the thing. Like, I don't think we want people to write code like if null, then do some crazy gymnastics.
But what would they do with any?
Crazy gymnastics. Or they would just ask, do you have an asset that's good for any? Which would just be standard non-platform specific IL.
I think rather than any, it would be much better for us to have a simple managed fallback that says if your Windows return win dash x64, x86, or ARM64, and if you're Linux of any kind, return Linux dash whatever, and same for OS X.
Yeah, that as an application developer, Tanner's proposal would surprise me the least.
But then as like new platforms come online, right? Like iOS, Android.
Yep. That's why I would consider it generally a bug. I would say our hosting API should make sure that we do not do that, right? So this would only carry the case where somebody has a crazy host, and if they don't do something sensible, then too bad, right?
Right. Like essentially, the returning any should be an unhit path, because all hosts should do it. But it does mean we can take the question mark out of the API signature. But having the managed fallback means we just have a lot of unused code, which seems wrong.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be unused. It would, if nothing else, give people who are on like 3.1 something they could copy and reuse. Because 5.0 is not going to be LTS anyways.
Right. But I mean, like, it seems to me bad if people copy and paste that stuff, right? Because the only case where you would have this likely is if a new platform shows up, right? So any hard-coded thing will also probably not work there either.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would prefer we either do some of that gymnastics ourselves as a fallback, or we just throw saying the host did something terribly wrong.
No, we don't like throwing out a property gets, though.
Yeah, I mean, I would honestly at that point make it, I don't know, fairly early in the runtime and just crash the process early on when the runtime is not initialized correctly.
But this would be a property getter that's misconfigured, though, so I think that would be okay for throwing.
Fair enough.
All right.
As long as it's discoverable that it threw.
So I think the general consensus is we don't like return null. So we can get rid of the question mark, and then the details on that are either any throw or a fallback, which is not exactly relevant when we're technically over time.
Yeah. So I asked in the chat earlier whether people are willing to stay a little bit longer to finish the other ones. So far, I got 3 thumbs up. Just give it a quick vote, and then we can go with the other issues. Because we have 3 more issues. I think will probably take us around 20 minutes to finish the other ones.
Sure.
All right, 7 thumbs up now. So I guess that makes it easy. All right, so that means we have 4. All right, let me close this one. All right, David, you're up.
So I would like to start saying that I would like to defer the review of this API. I mean, at least the final design for the subsequent meeting. Mostly because I shaped this API to reflect the changes that we discussed on the latest API review about this, which was to address changing from a class to an enum, which totally makes sense when you have two options, which were default and preserved. But in a funny matter, after I updated the description, a community member came and said that he wanted to use another property that is part of JSON.NET, but it's not already it is not already exposed on our API. So I would prefer to shape this into a class again, and maybe convey that with another functionality that might justify this being a class. So then we can review it. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me. Yeah. If you want to defer it, then we can totally do that.
Yeah, if there's a scenario where it makes sense to allow the reference handling to be a user implemented type, which of course means you have to design all of the inheritance models of it and have a sensible plugin system. If that's part of the feature, then that's fine.
Sure. Well, I was not thinking actually I was thinking more on a sealed class and making maybe more customizations just added to that type as a property. But I guess that should also fall into the scenario to review later.
Yeah, because the thing to keep in mind is if you end up with like two Boolean properties, that's just four values in an enum, and so it's about what makes the most sense to as a call mode. But yeah, I think we can easily defer. Like if you weren't here, we wouldn't have talked about it.
Cool.
All right. Do we need to follow up then for this one? Or is it just good as is? It seemed like you wanted to follow up on this one.
Well, we already most of this discussed. We already addressed that on the previous API. So I guess there is no need, there is no need for follow up unless someone has some concern with the final implementation.
No, maybe I misheard, but it seemed like you said they wanted to look at something at the beginning, but maybe I misunderstood what you said. Because this looks reasonable to me based on what you said.
Yeah, but someone came up with an scenario about adding a reference resolver, for example, which is something that we currently don't know expose. We implement it internally, but it's not part of the. We don't expose it anywhere. So it will be nice to turn this into a class and add that and expose that into the reference handler type, right?
Right. So I think David, we probably still want to review that new ape design, right? So once you're ready with the new design, let's bring it back and we can relook at it, right? The class version with all the way.
Yeah.
Because whether the extensibility is in a type called reference resolver or the extensibility is in a type called reference handler, like it sounds like you're wanting to design an extensibility mechanism into this, and we can't. If you have a scenario for it and you design it for it, then that's fine, and we can review it as is. I think we only moved you to the enum in the previous one because it was described as being closed and not really growing again.
Yeah.
Is this scenario somebody wants to implement the equals method?
No, they want to implement their own reference resolver in order to keep track of references and keep the state and save the state across multiple serializations. So they just want to make the dictionaries static instead of non-static.
And they want to use GUIDs rather than implement IDs as their ID.
But yeah, so I think if the question that you were coming with, David, is would it be okay to go back to a class if there's a reason? Sure, but we can't really talk about it without a concrete proposal.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I just bumped it back to API needs work, added a comment, and then, yeah, that's totally reasonable. I mean, as Jeremy said, right, originally we just bumped you to an enum because it seemed like over-engineered, but if you have a concrete scenario for that, let's review that and then just have that extension point. That seems also reasonable.
Cool.
All right, so then 2 more. Add a copy constructor to JsonSerializerOptions.
Yeah. Okay, so this one, right now, ASP.NET needs to create a copy based on their JSON serializer options, just to set one property, which is the encoder. So they can set the relaxed encoding on their options when the user does not pass its own encoding, right? So right now they implemented a method to copy all the relevant all the options that they want to into the new instance of the JSON serializer options, but such thing needs to be maintained every time we add something to the JSON serializer options. So, for example, for the newest previews that we expose reference handling, the reference handling feature on the options, there are customers, there are users on ASP.NET and MVC that are not able to use reference handling because the code on ASP.NET is not copying this new property on the options. So basically, what we want to bring here is to create is for us to provide JSON serializer options copy constructor, so they don't need to maintain their own logic to copy the option.
Yeah, and this is going to flush it's not going to copy the type cache and it'll go back into an editable mode, right?
Yeah, no, I think Steve added a comment regarding that, but I think we shouldn't copy the cache.
Yeah. Because this is because I can see this is a reasonable scenario. You have some options, you've already serialized with it, you want to tweak it to one thing, but the type is now locked because you serialized something. So as long as it's ignoring the cache and unlocking itself, it makes sense to me.
Yeah. In addition to the caches, you can add converters. Before you serialize, you can add them at runtime through the converters.add method, and that requires a little special logic. But I talk about that later in this issue or that referenced issue. I'm not sure which one.
But effectively, it's copying all of the public state, not the hidden state, and it goes back into writable mode.
Yeah, we don't want to link the instances in any way.
Yeah, I mean that makes total sense to me.
Do we have preferences whether we like a copy constructor or a method on the type that just gives you back a new instance with all the settings copied?
Copy constructors tend to be a more common pattern, I think.
Is there derived types that we ever care about? Like this isn't a sealed class?
It says sealed.
It's sealed.
It is sealed.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. It's not right next to class.
Because partial has to go before the word class or structure.
Right.
I off the top of my head, I can't think of examples one way or the other. But since it's a sealed type, I think the copy constructor doesn't have inheritance complications.
Yeah, I mean, like even if you were to inherit it, right, you would just chain it, right? People would have to opt into this, and then it would actually be somewhat nicer to have a copy constructor rather than a clone method, right?
Yeah, I mean, it gets slightly weird if you say new JSON serializer options of derived JSON serializer options, but you chose to be type limiting in that case.
Yeah. One of the other things I'm thinking is that if you knew up a collection, like a list of T, a dictionary of T, stuff like that, you can pass into those constructors another list, another dictionary, things like that. Like we do have precedent in the framework for copy constructors as opposed to copy methods.
That's fair. I mean, it certainly is easier for other things, right? Because you can just use connection initializer syntax if you do a constructor, right? Yeah, makes sense to me. I like it as is.
Yep.
I was just wondering what other people think. All right.
So wait, hold on. What are we doing about the converters list? Steve, you mentioned that we should also copy the converters list. Why?
Otherwise, we're not cloning the converters that were added before the first serialize.
But that converters list grows and changes, right? So
I proposed only adding the converters that the user originally added before the first serial. As soon as you do the first serialize or deserialize, we make it immutable and don't allow you to add any more converters. So
right, but since we are unlocking it, I think it will be surprising to think that the previous converters that were originally added get added again, because now the context could be completely different, right? Like
it's the same. It's exactly the same, except the converters that will be added later at runtime could be different based if somebody decides to add some more converters. I mean, converters are part of the options, right? At least the ones added before you start serializing. When you start serializing, you might get more converters added. Those are derived from the ones that were previously added.
So maybe I'm missing something, but are you saying that the system itself adds converters doing serialization?
Like a factory converter returns another converter which is cached. That's all.
I see. So basically, but you're basically suggesting that when the copy constructor runs, the only thing we copy is what the user added to the original JsonSerializer options.
Yes.
I think that seems reasonable, because otherwise it would be very weird if you would only copy half the object, right?
It would be weird to me if it's missing.
It might be weird both ways, though, right? Like, I can see why Steve's point that yes, we should add the converters that the user explicitly added themselves. But it's also weird to say, hey, I just created a copy constructor. Now I have to undo all the additions of the converters that someone else added by adding my own or somehow removing them.
It would be strange to me if the options class reflected data that took place at runtime when the serializer was already running.
Yeah,
like generally options are how you create the serializer. They're not supposed to maintain state on the serializer instance itself.
It hides it in private data.
Yeah, I think everybody agrees with that statement. I think the question that Arsenal is raising is, should we copy any converters? And I would argue it would be very surprising to me if we didn't, because if I want to clone or run a copy constructor, I would expect the entire state that I put in there to also be reflected in the new object. And if I don't want this, yes, you have to undo them. I mean, but that's not different from any other setting on that object, right?
Like the encoding, the encoder property is another one. You can specify the encoder. We copy that. You can specify converter. We copy that.
Yeah, I would expect everything that has already been set via public API is reflected in the clone, and if that includes a list of converters, and so it should be essentially you do some stuff, you run it through the copy constructor, and now one of them you set camel case or casing to camel case, and the other one you set to snake case, and now they are identical except for casing.
Yeah, I agree.
Steve, can you clarify something for me? So when the serializer is already running, is the actual converter list as reflected in the public API being mutated, or is it just an implementation detail that stuff is cached?
No, only the cache is mutated at runtime. So I think I might have some comments in here that need to be cleaned up when I said we need to enumerate that list only up to the point before serialization occurred.
So when I create the options class and I populate the converters list, I use the serializer a little bit, and then I query the converters list again. The list that I get back is going to be the exact same as the list that went in, correct? No entries were added, removed, or mutated?
Yes, because basically you try to call the add method, and that's not allowed. And the underlying list that we return is never. It's not. We use a cache, a dictionary, and not the list to store the converter.
Okay, yeah, I was just looking for clarification on that. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, like I said, I think my comment I need to delete a sentence in my comment. If you're looking at that, I'm not sure, but
yeah, that's what I was basing my question on.
Yeah, okay, so that makes sense. I just wanted to bring it up because I understand that in either way, someone could be confused. But I buy the argument that having everything being copied from the public surface area makes more sense.
Cool.
Yeah, because if you only copy part, then you have to explain what part and why, right? It seems very arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
The only nit I would have is we change the parameter name in the constructor to be options, not source.
Yeah, I looked at that and I didn't have a strong opinion Options seems better than source.
Yeah.
What name do other copy constructors use?
Well, it depends on what you have, but it's similar with extension methods. Or we don't really have the one parameter name for extension methods or copy constructors because it kind of depends on what your inputs are. Usually we name them after the type, right?
So, so an analogy for that could be, let's say, the list of t constructor that takes an I enumerable of t, and that thing has the parameter being collection.
I see.
Well, that often is called source, but like that's also similar to, because that's just how enumerables are often named, right? That is not necessarily because it's copy constructor. But yeah.
No, the parameter is called collection, not source.
Yeah, but it's also not list of t. It's I collection or I.
Oh, I
So it's not exactly a copy constructor. It just functions as one.
So do we have copy constructor type patterns elsewhere in the framework?
I'm sure we do. I just can't think of any.
I mean, you kind of do, right? I mean, you can totally pass in a list of t to a list of t, except it just happens to be typed as I collection because that makes more sense. But effectively, it operates as the copy constructor, right?
Right.
Cool. Alrighty, so then let's just close this guy here and move on to the last one, which might be easy or hard.
We'll see. So right now we have a way to ignore null values, which is globally applied. And that means across the entire object graph that we're serializing or deserializing, so every property. So we can ignore null values using the JSON serializer ignore null values Boolean option. But there's no way to currently include only a subset of properties to be ignored or exclude them. So based on the value of ignore null options, so say that were to be true, there's no way to include some properties which are null. And in the opposite case, if ignore null values is false, there's no way to exclude some of the properties from that rule. And that applies to both serialization and deserialization. So this issue is about providing a way to per property ignore null values. So JSON.NET has a null value handling enum, which is applied on, which is a global option on their JSON serializer settings, and also null value handling enum that's applied per property. So the semantics introduced by this issue give us some parity. So the reason why I want to do this now is this is a popular request by customers and also by, and a lot of people need it. So the proposed API here is to have a condition for which each property is ignored. So the three values are always, when null, and never. So one thing to keep in mind is the backlog for 5.0 includes a proposal for default value ignore. So indicating some default value for like a struct or even if the value reference type, say this is default value and then ignore that. So a future extension point for this for 5.0 most likely dependent on other features would be to add a when default property as enum value as well. So that's the JSON ignore condition. And then there'll be a new condition property on JSON ignore attribute, which will be default value will be JSON ignore condition always, which gives us parity with the current default behavior. So if you don't specify that condition, then it defaults to always, which is just slapping on the JSON ignore as we do today, and that means always ignore this regardless of what value it is in the JSON or what CLR value on serialization.
Right.
Okay, so so that's the API included a few like usage scenarios where so always, yeah, so like I said, always be just like you have JSON ignore nothing else. So when null, so considering two properties where we both say that they should be ignored when null. So given the JSON, we have a value for the class property. So we do not, so we deserialize it because it's not null. Yep, and then we set the value, we can set that the value is set. Then we leave dictionary because we set to ignore it when null. So notice we didn't have to specify a global option here to say ignore null values. So, yep. So, and then on serialize, so we set to ignore it when null. Then, so the value of simple class in this example object. Yeah, so when we new the object again, then the class value is null, and then so we skip it on serialization basically. So the other interesting scenario here is when we have never. So I mean, are there any questions so far about the behavior? If not,
so when null is so logically the global setting that we have, ignore null values, is the default, right? So if you have a JSON ignore property, sorry, attribute present, then we'll always take precedence no matter what the global setting is, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Yeah.
Just for clarification, the attribute is already existing. We're just adding a property.
Yep, this attribute already exists today. So the never allows us to say regardless of what the global option, the null values option on JsonSerializer option is, never like ignore this value. So so if you have JSON, so if you have ignore null values true, and then the property you have the condition never ignore it, then it will be deserialized and serialized. So the example shows the same. So here we have the first property which doesn't have any the JSON ignore attribute or condition. So when that is null, we do not serialize. We do not deserialize it because we're not trying to deserialize it null into that. But the next property has that it should always be deserialized or serialized. Then we set that to null. So, and the same goes for serialization. So serialize the other value, the class value is null, and then dictionary is null, but we serialize it because we're told to always serialize it. So a few considerations here. So null cannot be deserialized into value types right now. This serializer will throw a JSON exception, even when JSON ignore null values is applied. So we have an open issue to relax this behavior, and when we see null, just like don't attempt to deserialize or serialize. Well, a value type can have a value null on serialize, so that issue is only on deserialization. So when we fix that, then we'll circle back and then make sure that we ignore null values for value types on a per property basis as well. And then so the other thing, last thing I already mentioned is that we're considering to ignore default values on serialization and serialization. So we're likely to add a ignore default values option on JsonSerializerOptions. Then for parity and because people will likely need it, we'll circle back and add a when default property, enum condition on JSON ignore condition. So yeah, that's about it for this proposal. Are there any questions or?
The null with value types thing seems to me the same as if I give a string to a value type of it makes no sense, so it should fail, but that's a different conversation. I think this looks fine as is.
Should we add the ignore default now? Like, I don't see why we would wait for that. It makes sense.
Because if we do it and don't add the other feature, then it sounds like it won't write down a 0 for an int.
Well, yeah, we'll have to start respecting some attribute to tell us the default value. likely the default value attribute. And then it just seems, yeah. So based on Jeremy's points, we haven't done the global behavior yet. So we should wait till we do that, because there are some open questions, I think, around comparing the default values for structs as far as performance goes. Like, so yeah, those, I think the default value ignore needs to be like, first of all, it's more a backlog issue and feature at this point, and then it requires some extra thinking. So I think that should be done separately, and then we add it when we address that issue.
All right, that's fine, as long as you're confident that the enum and the current solution is extensible to that feature.
Yes, yeah, we can easily add that. The other thing is, if people want to have a when null or default, I think it's reasonable to add that as an enum option, rather than do like some type of flag solution where we make the enum and a flag, but then we have to do some like validation to make sure you don't do like never and always. So I think when default and when null or default could be potential things that we could add in the future, dependent. When default more likely, but when null or default dependent on if people are asking for that.
So maybe this is a general pattern for enums where only a couple of them can have Boolean logic attached to them, that we keep them as separate enums rather than having the enum becoming a flag. Is that how we generally do things?
The guidance for flags is you should never have a combination of bits that's invalid.
Okay, so in that case, keep it as an enum and just name it correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So that's it for this issue.
All right. So, like, what's the conclusion on the ignore default? Is it a separate one?
It's just separate. When we go and look into default value handling, ignoring default values, then in that proposal, we'll have to include another enum value for default values for when default. So future, so not including that now, but we'll do it later.
That's a larger feature, and it has to also deal with like whether you want to write out null. Some people might want to, write out defaults. Some people might want to always write out defaults, and so yeah, splitting them up into two separate feature requests makes sense to me.
Yeah, I assume this is only here to show that you've thought about it for potential upcoming features and that you believe it is extensible.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So
All
the
right.
conclusion is, this is awesome and I like it.
Nice.
Oh, well, if it makes Asin happy, we should ship it.
We should. I agree with us.
Thank you.
All right. Then this is it for today. Thank you, everybody, for staying around for a bit longer. And then I see you later at some point.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
At some point.
Thanks.
Bye.